So every time you make a code change, you'd have to make it across each language code base. I mean, it's just crazy to even think about that. And I'm just like, okay, that's the hill you want to die on, is not to internationalize your code. But I told them it's nuts.
Do you remember the first time you fell in love with internationalization?
I don't think it was a specific moment. I came into the industry in language QA, and as I was testing, I started to see some of those challenges. And one of the really unusual ones was keyboard sharing when you have a shared workspace, where you can share like a whiteboard or something, which was part of the video conferencing software that we were testing. If the person on the other side has a keyboard with a Japanese IME turned on, for example, input method editor, how does that translate to the other side? How is the shared whiteboard going to represent, the typing? It has to be aware of the IME being on, and there was all kinds of issues around that. That's a pretty advanced internationalization challenge, and that's very fascinating to me, that how the developers worked on that and tried to figure that out. Those are very complex problems. So I was fascinated by those kind of things that came up during the testing. And video conferencing particularly has some really interesting stuff, because you have different connection speeds, and in different geographies, some geographies they just have lower speeds, and you have to have a good experience. That's internationalization too, right? To allow different physical locations to have the same experience in a shared environment, like a video call. Some people maybe don't think about it as internationalization, but it is too. So a lot of the issues around that beyond the localization. I just thought it was fascinating how, you have to prepare the software for translation, to show fonts, for example, for different languages. When you translate the interface into Japanese, we did Japanese and German in this first product, and so it's a fascination with those kind of problems and seeing how the developers solved them. At the time, I didn't know anything, right? And so it wasn't just one moment I fell in love with it, and but I always liked those challenges and kept adding to my knowledge about those things with every product I worked on. So I think that's kind of how it happened.
Did that initial fascination sort of let you to go to a different, let's say, role than testing?
Yes, testing was a little bit repetitive to me, because you basically, you have a product build, a preliminary build put in front of you. You have a piece of software, and then you just, run through your cycles and report bugs, and then you verify them when they're fixed. It gets a little bit repetitive. And so I was like, well, why can I be involved in the fixing? The fixing of issues is a lot more interesting to me. And so I started to just kind of help out with that kind of stuff. In my role, I got more into that. It's like, who is fixing this stuff? And, I realized they didn't really have an engineer who would do that. And so I just kind of pushed myself into that role, and eventually switched over entirely to the engineering.
Mm-hmm. I guess for a lot of people, when you talk about working as a localization engineer, it's not necessarily related to internationalization. Were you able to, I don't know, get yourself into internationalization when you started working as an engineer, or was it still what we normally know from the, let's say, the vendor side that engineers typically do?
I was able to get myself into it because I saw that as the localization engineer who does pre-processing and bug fixing, post-processing, you interface with the QA team, right? You get to see the defects that they submitted. And I noticed that at least in this specific group I was in, the QA lead or the testers didn't really know which bugs were just things you could fix linguistically, and which bugs were maybe required a developer to fix an underlying internationalization issue. So I felt that the LE needs to have that knowledge so they can as they go through the defects, if they get the raw set of defects from that are not scrubbed by anybody with that knowledge already, you get a mix of things, and you need to know quickly, what can I fix, right? And then add the internationalization issue to the developer queue, and you want to be able to also add some information to it. So you want to be able to troubleshoot maybe some things, figure out, okay, what is really the underlying issue here? Because the developers they like that when you give them a little bit of that troubleshooting info. It's easier for them to fix a bug because they're not internationalization experts either. If they're not part of the localization team, if they're just software developers out there. So I think I realized this is my role. I can add value here by figuring that out, adding appropriate information, and routing things to the developer or to a linguist, or fix it myself, right? So, and if you're the better you get at that, when you're talking large volumes of defects, you can move really fast, right? And get through hundreds of defects. And as you get more experience, within seconds, you immediately know, okay, this is internationalization. This is something I can fix. This should go to linguist. And that's where you become more valuable, I think, as an LE, if you have that knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I think is interesting is that initially you said that when you were working as a tester, you got fascinated by what you could be doing more, and that's what led you to engineering. And now you talked about developers. Did you ever think about actually going even further, say upstream, and becoming a developer? Or why does the role of an engineer who, let's say, specializes or has so much interest in internationalization, why is that, let's say, your final station?
It's a pretty simple answer. I don't like coding. I've tried it. I've done a little bit of coding. I've never formally learned it, but I did some coding in the way early times, and I just didn't really enjoy it. I find it very tedious. I think it's fun to create that way, but I found the process very tedious. And I think so somehow my mind and coding didn't really align. Could I have become a coder? Probably. But I mean, I think I have to, I have the intelligence if I had applied myself, but it just didn't appeal to me.
All right. So speaking about internationalization, maybe for those who don't know what we're talking about, what is your definition? You mentioned something that I would never think about, like the different internet speed that need to be solved, for example, for a conferencing software. I never thought that something like that would be a criteria for internationalization. So what do you understand with internationalization, and why is it important?
Well, I think it's any modification to a product that allows the product to be used worldwide, geographically, by any user speaking any language, ideally, in best case, right? So it should function worldwide in as many environments as possible by as many people as possible. That's, to me, is the very broad strokes. Now, for each product, that's, of course, is a different challenge. You can have a product box of a product, and you can internationalize the box by having multilingual instructions on it, right? Or providing information about, does it contain power cords for different countries, or a country-specific power cord? That's internationalization too. So there's just an odd example that people may not think about. It's not just software. It can be in other areas too, hardware too, right? If you ship a washing machine to one country or the other, you have the correct plug with it. It's internationalization too. Providing manuals in different languages, but then for software, of course, that's my specialty. I'm not specializing in washing machines.
Right. Too bad. But is there a scenario where we who work in the localization, especially if you're working on the vendor side, can somehow impact something about, let's say, what power cord should be used? Or is this the internationalization that has to be done by the, let's say, the manufacturer or the client?
Yeah, I mean, if we were in some way involved in that process, is of course having that knowledge. I would certainly point it out if I see something. I have worked with product packaging occasionally, localization of product packaging, and may have pointed out some things there. Not can't come up with a specific example, but Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Right. Okay. So localization. Speaking of localization, how do those two terms relate to each other? You mentioned the packaging. Okay, so we, I guess, obviously understand that you translate whatever is on the box. But how do internationalization and localization relate to each other?
It, I think people, if you ask different people, you get slightly different answers. Um, what I see a lot, localization is the adaptation to a specific region or country, right? Whereas the internationalization is to get it ready so it can be adapted. So it's kind of a two. The one can't happen without the other. You can't localize without internationalization, but you can internationalize without localization. One has to come first. If you can't translate a user interface, then you can't make a German app, right? If everything is hard coded and it's basically impossible to translate the strings, then you can't localize. Um, if you have address formats, for example, in an ordering system, if the system is not internationalized to handle different address formats, being through CLDR, I believe it's called, which I haven't used actively, sadly. Then if you don't make it ready for that, then you can't adapt, right? The address formats, you can't support different address formats if the system is not ready to do it. So yeah, I think it's a really two things that have to happen in sequence. And then localization itself, can be translation, but also can be adaptation of the content. Could be marketing adaptation, right? Like stuff like address formats, picking picking a UI font that's appealing to, for example, for Thai. That's localization, but making the software able to where you can choose a font and not just using some default font. That's internationalization to me.
I lost my thought right now. Wait, what did I want to ask? Oh, yes. The example that you gave that if strings are hard coded, I think that's like one of the most common examples that people give, at least in my experience, when they talk about internationalization. You said that you can do localization. Is it really that it's impossible, or it's
No,
just
it's not
harder to
impossible. It's
do
not
it?
impossible. You'd have to duplicate the code for each language, right? And then translate the strings inside the code, which there may not be a parser to automatically parse that, so you'd have to do it manually. And then you have multiple sets of the same code. So every time you make a code change, you'd have to make it across each language code base. I mean, it's just crazy to even think about that. But yet, I've worked on projects where that was done. And I couldn't get the dev team to change their ways. It has happened. And I'm just like, okay, that's the hill you want to die on, is not to internationalize your code. But I told them it's nuts. Maybe not in those words, but they just like, we don't have the resources to do it. But then how many resources do you need to manually keep all that up to date? So it doesn't make sense.
So, since you failed in that situation to convince someone, why do you think some companies or some clients are not willing to invest in internationalization? And maybe then we can talk about like what is that investment actually look like?
That's really the $1 million question. And I literally mean $1 million questions, because that's the cost, right? For a larger company with larger products, the cost is in the millions, I believe, if you don't internationalize. I think education is the first part, and you try that, and it depends if you're working for a localization provider and you work for a large company. First, you don't have the same amount of leverage. If you're an employee of that big company, you're both employees, like the developer is and I am, then maybe I have a little more leverage. I have easier paths to escalate it. If you're working for a localization provider, you may not have that leverage. They may not take you as seriously because you're from an outside company. It's like, why would I listen to that guy, right? So education is the first part. Sometimes development teams are short-staffed, so especially if their internationalization is so behind that the effort would be huge. They already have a huge code base. very well established product that we've run into that a lot, where we get pulled into a product that was released for years, in English only in most cases, and we looked at the internationalization and it was just impossible, or it would have been a really huge effort. Then they might have not have the staffing to do it, or the release cycles are so tight that there's just no time in between. But we've also had cases where they said, okay, this is the right thing to do, but it may take us a couple of releases to actually fully internationalize. And then they would either wait on localization, or they would do brute force localization for a little while and then go to proper localization. So I've seen all of that in my career. But yeah, I think those are some of the reasons. But without dedication, it's not going to happen, because software developers simply are not going to know what internationalization is unless they work in the industry or have worked on a project where that was a big deal. But yeah, I wish it was on the roadmap for every project, right? Shipping the requirements should be enforced by development team management, just like any other requirements for a piece of software.
From what you were saying, to me, it looks like if, let's say, a big company decides to do internationalization and they're behind, that there is a huge investment. Is there something that they could do partially? Or is it really like you either do it or do it well, or you don't do it at all? Can you do like some smaller steps?
Yeah, I think you can do it partially. If you had to prioritize certain things. So, for example, if you say, well, we need to translate the user interface, but we may have to hold off on some of the other issues. I think what you do is you do a full internationalization assessment of the product. So you identify all the issues: hard-coded strings, right? Address formats, number formats, date formats, UI fonts, many other things, data input, output, things like that. So everything use Unicode in the background, things like that. So you identify everything that you can, and then you figure out what would be the effort with the development team. You figure out what would be the effort for each item to get it supported, and then you prioritize based on that. What would have the biggest user impact? Like if you can't hard-coded strings, you need to translate into German, you have to move the strings to a resource file of some sort. You have to separate them from the code. That's a must do. So that is top, right? And then the other things you'd have to just prioritize. What's the user impact? Can you live with some of the things if the effort is too big? And some of them you might see that they're really small things, we call low-hanging fruit, easy to fix. Just fix them. Don't even debate it. So that the stuff that's like 15 minutes to code, you just fix. And then the things that take 100 hours, then you have to prioritize. But there might be some tool to help you. I know there's some tools to extract strings from code, either do it automatically or at least flag everything. And so there's some help there in some cases too. But yeah, that's how I would approach it. Do a full assessment and then prioritize.
Mm-hmm. When do you think a company should start thinking about internationalization? Let's say that we're focusing on new companies like startups.
Today. So as soon as possible, right? Yeah. Well, yesterday is not going to help you, but yes, I think as you can see, like once you have the idea for a product, I think it should come into play right away before you put any effort into it. If it's an idea and you actually have a high probability of putting the idea into a product, turning it into a product, at that point, you would like to have somebody on the team who at least understands basic aspects of internationalization, because I review wireframes sometimes of products. They're not, fully fledged out. They just show approximately what kind of layout they want and how the screens are supposed to look. That's where you already want to have a review of things. And then you want to train the developers in best practices for internationalization, so they don't start writing code and already creating problems. So you do want to do some training on the developers before they write the first line of code. So I think it's those three things mainly that I can think of. So training the developers, reviewing anything visual early, and also looking at market requirements. Are there any specific market requirements? Is the product going to have to look differently besides language and fonts and data formats, those are kind of a given. But is there other things where you need the adjustment for, if you use currencies or, like I said, address formats, I think was another one that maybe a little more out there that people don't think about right away. So I think that, including even maybe marketing marketing people sit down with an internationalization person, go over some of that and see if there's some stuff there that they didn't think about.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing that stood out for me was the wireframes, that you actually looked at wireframes. What is it that you look at when it comes to wireframes?
Yeah, it's kind of from a UX point of view, right? You see the way elements are arranged that won't, like, for example, if you have a label and then you have a text box, you would want the label to be above the text box. So there's room for the text to expand, and then the box below, instead of the label being to the left of the text box. And then you have to worry about word wrapping and everything becomes more difficult. You also want to think about if they're going to be bidirectional languages, maybe how, that maybe not quite into wireframes, but how it's going to flip and all that. That's a whole separate issue that we may touch on. But yeah, I think that's the kind of stuff I look out for. What would happen if the text expands or contracts? Is it going to mess with that layout? Or how flexible is it going to be? Buttons and stuff. If you cram too many buttons next to each other, they have no room to expand easily. Things like that, or narrow columns with text in it. Those kind of issues.
Maybe let's have a debate about this thing, because I'm not sure if I agree with you, or maybe I'll try to explain it to you from the perspective of a really bootstrap startup. Like if you're bootstrapping a company, and let's say you have an idea for an app, maybe if you're confident, or maybe if you have VC money or some money in the bank, then maybe yes, you can think about, okay, we have the best team in the world, we have a great idea, we're going to build this, and 2-3 years from now on, maybe our product will be everywhere in the world. But then there are a lot of startups that probably don't have this extra cash sitting in the bank to afford someone like internationalization consultant. They don't have time to train their developers. They just want to get their MVP or the first version of their app out, just to first try and see if what they assumed about the customers in the market actually sticks. And maybe once they get some initial traction, maybe that's when, at least to me, it would make more sense to start thinking about the taking over the whole world with your app.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, especially if it's a small product, it's not a huge user interface and a lot of user interaction. Of course, it's not going to be that hard to internationalize later. But if you're thinking some big enterprise solution, right? If you're like, oh, I'm going to create something like Salesforce, just better, I think it'd be foolish not to think about it up front. And when it comes to, like you said, having the money to hire somebody. I mean, if it's a small application, give me 2 hours of my time. Pay me $300 an hour for 2 hours, and I'll do it for you. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not. It actually, you'd be surprised with a smaller product how quickly you can identify probably the top 10 issues. It doesn't take that much time if somebody's experienced. So it'd still be money well spent, even with a small amount of funding. But yeah, I see. I mean, there's a place and a time for, depending on what you're developing, of course. So I'm not totally disagreeing with you, but I think you should at least think about it, right? Is it worth my time? Is it going to be harder later? But again, the people who are creating those products are not going to have that knowledge. So I just want to save people from having the big wake-up call later.
So why is it? Why do you think that the people, and we're talking about the developers, they don't know anything about this? Do you think that internationalization is still somewhat neglected thing that should be taught in all the boot camps and all the courses?
Yeah, of course it should be. Yeah, and it's not. I don't think it is. I mean, I'm sure there's some examples out there. I think maybe an instructor or a creator of content, is aware of those things and actually throws in some mentions of that. But honestly, I don't see it very often, and I'd love to be proven wrong by somebody. But most software engineers just don't know. It's just, I mean, I've interfaced with hundreds and hundreds of software engineers in my career, and they, even the ones that we've worked with for a while and we've pointed stuff out, they still keep forgetting, and you have to keep reminding them. So people who've never been exposed to it, they just don't know.
So do you think, like, who should be responsible for changing the, I don't know, the education of developers? Should it be the education system or anybody who's training developers, or should it be us people from the localization?
Good question. I mean, in old times, I think people became software developers through, they would go to university and study computer science. So of course, I think that's one place where I'd love to see it. I think it should be mandatory, that's part of the curriculum. So that's the education system. And nowadays it's different, right? You can go on YouTube and learn how to code. There's so many good resources out there. So it would be on the individual creator of content to have that awareness and weave it into their content, which is probably just as challenging to achieve because there are thousands of content creators out there. Books, I guess there are probably books. You can learn it from a book too, and kind of old style, but I'm sure there are good books out there. Again, it would have to be part of the content. So it's everybody who creates content would have to, if they don't put it in there, the audience is not going to know.
But I assume that from your experience and also from my experience, it usually actually comes down to people from, let's say, our industry, right? Who have to do the education once the company sort of realizes that, okay, localization, I don't know, costs us too much, or the people from the localization are complaining too much. What should we do about it? And then they are like, oh, we should maybe do something about the way we write software. So do you think it's like a balance, or what role do you think that the LSPs or people in localization should play in the education of developers?
Well, I think they should play a huge role because they're the ones who know the most about it. And it just, you have to be given the opportunity, right? I mean, I was with a large company, not an LSP, for a long time, doing work for Intel, and I did definitely have more leverage when I was an employee. Like I mentioned before, you're just taken more seriously, and we had very long-term relationships with some of the product teams. We had products that we worked on for 20 years, and that gets fun because people really start. You keep pointing out those issues, and they are starting to learn, especially if you have little turnover on the development team side. So that's the other thing. I think you see more contracted out software development these days. So companies will hire software developers to help with some things. And then, of course, they don't have control over that level of knowledge that people have. There's more turnover. So it gets more difficult. So yeah, I think it's up to the LSPs, and it's an ongoing thing. I mean, you're always going to have to continue doing that. Would it be great if somebody said, hey, I'm going to contact universities that teach computer science and I'm going to ask about that? And I'm going to even, somebody could offer that as a service, right? You could say, would you pay me to teach your software, your professors or whoever is teaching the courses to teach some of that? I mean, that'd be fantastic. It's probably not going to be me. I'm too late in my career. I don't want to take.
That was my question.
I don't want to take that on. I don't want to take that on. It would be fantastic. I think it's a pretty big thing, considering that how many, institutions, learning institutions are out there that teach that. So I think it would be a very, very huge undertaking. It's as big as an undertaking as another interest of mine, which is personal finance, which is also not taught in schools. And there I see it. It's just actually interesting to draw that parallel for a second. I know a lot of people in the personal finance community that are making that effort. They are working with schools to bring that to people, young people, either in high school or college, to really learn about personal finance, because most people know very little about it. They don't know how to manage money, right? And I see a lot of efforts there. I don't see it with this as much, except for the couple schools that are actually have a localization curriculum. There it's taught, right? But on the software development side, I think I would love to see some people take that on. You could probably create a company around that just does that kind of education. But it's a hard sell because you have to show people that they actually need it, right? You have to prove that. And that's always been, I think, the hardest, to actually really have people understand, your audience, that this matters and you need to know this. to convince them. That's been very difficult.
So why is it not going to be you?
I already have a job, and I'm starting a new
Okay.
I'm starting a new job tomorrow, which is actually interestingly, I'm happy to share that it's a senior globalization lead role for Nike, and that is exactly that role where you have this one person who literally the function is just globalization. So it's going to be working with all the different parties involved that create the products to make sure awareness of internationalization is here, the right methods are used, things are addressed in a timely manner, working with QA teams, working with potentially marketing people, developers, uh, program managers, project managers, everybody in localization to just kind of be that one person who all that stuff goes through and gets assessed and then communicated and people get educated. So I'm already doing that, but just within, it's enough doing that for one company. I don't know if I can do it for the whole world, but yeah, it's actually really awesome. I think it's an awesome thing to do, but you have to find a place, and you also most people have to earn some money, so it has to be for most people it have to be some kind of paid opportunity as well. So, and that's another thing that might be difficult, right? Educating universities about it is one thing, but how do you monetize that?
Do you think someone who is educating the developers about internationalization should ideally be a developer themselves?
I don't think they have to be. It's helpful in some cases. So I've had some cases where I can read a little bit of code and look at something and maybe see some issues. Depends a little bit on language. You can also look up stuff. You can always find, people run into problems. You can find some discussion topics. Um, it's helpful, certainly, if it's easier for you to troubleshoot something, you can be more helpful to the developer because you can already look at the problem and say, I think your problem is right here. I have limited ability to do that, but um, what I do is, because I usually don't get that deep, is to just identify the problem and say, this is what it should look like, but you'll have to maybe look at your framework that you're using and how you exactly solve that on a code level. I may not be able to give it an answer. But I haven't had a lot of issues where people say, well, I understand what you're telling me, but I don't know how to fix it. That's been pretty rare. And, we'll go out there and do some investigation. We usually figure it out. So yeah, I can give them kind of the concept of how it should be fixed, and then how they exactly implement it in the code. I can't really tell them, and that where it would be helpful to be able to code, because then you could be more specific with your solutions. But maybe it's better if the developer has to look into that a little bit. Maybe they learn more if they have to go a little deeper. So if you tell somebody the solution, it may not be the exact same learning than if they have to spend a little bit of time trying to find the solution. So pros and cons, I guess.
Yeah, I think I meant it mostly from the perspective of, like developers, I guess, like to hang out with developers, So if somebody from the localization comes to them, they're like, who is this guy? Like,
Yeah,
is
it
it
can
worth my
happen.
time?
Yeah, you may not be
So you
taking it
can find
seriously.
like a common
Yeah.
ground.
Yeah, no, I think it would help definitely in that regard. So it's certainly not a bad thing. I know a few people who were in our team at Intel who are developers, and they had some advantages in that regard because they could come up with the actual solution, or just go a little deeper on some stuff. So certainly not going to harm you to have that knowledge. But I don't want people to think if I don't write code, I can't do internationalization. I think that'd be foolish.
So I know, and maybe we haven't said it in this interview explicitly, maybe we mentioned it in previous content that we did together, is you already mentioned that you work for Intel directly for the biggest chunk of your career,
Yeah,
and then
20
you
years. Yeah,
move to the vendor side,
right.
but still working for Intel
Yes.
as the client.
Yes.
And you touched on this before, that the people from the vendor side have it more difficult to affect what is happening on the dev side. But since you had those relationships personally, Did you feel like something changed once you moved to the vendor side, or was it still more or less the same?
Both. It I still had that leverage with the groups that I've kept working with. So there were some teams that um, I worked with for, when I was an Intel employee for 10 plus years. And then just for context for people, that Intel decided to outsource um, all the localization. So they took basically the internal localization team and basically engaged the vendor to provide those services. And then so unfortunately, a lot of us, didn't keep our jobs at Intel, and some of us chose to move to that other provider to continue working for Intel. And that was actually maybe one of my motivations, that I like my customers, I like the work, and I can continue to support them. I'm going to add more value for that vendor because I already know all this stuff, right? I already know Intel. If that company had to provide all new resources that are not Intel trained and knowledgeable, they would have had a more difficult time to provide that service. So they tried to hire some of us so that they can get that knowledge in house and then provide the service to Intel. And so it did help with my established customers to continue working with them because they took me just as seriously. They know that I know and that I'm helpful, and they come to me with the same questions. So there was no difference there. A little more difficult with new customers, new products that came to us. You have to establish that. But if you speak to somebody intelligently, you show them some of the issues, you show them how to solve them, you show them that it's not impossible and how it improves the product, most reasonable people will see the value you're bringing. So it's just a little more work to establish that. And you won't get that trust from everybody. From some people, you won't get it, but it's always worth trying because it's so much more fun to work with a team when you establish that relationship, right? Instead of having this separation of localization is over here, the project manager talks to the product team, and that's the only connection. You have no technical connection. It's not a good way to work. So I always thrive to create those connections, and that's really, to me, is where the fun is, working with customers directly.
You just mentioned the technical connection. I think that is an interesting point because a lot of the people that I work with, who are trained to be project managers, in those setups, it's usually just a project manager that pretty much handles everything. Like a lot of the smaller LSPs, they don't have any localization engineer, not yet someone who is specialized in internationalization. Do you think it's important, even for the smaller LSPs, to have someone more technical in their team, assuming that their clients are actually doing something like software or like apps? Or do you think that maybe the PM should be someone like a jack of all trades and also know stuff about technicalities and internationalization?
It's hard to cover all those roles fully. One person, that's really difficult. There are some people who can do it. Um, I would claim I can probably project manage a project reasonably well. Maybe not, not at the same level as somebody really experienced it. Maybe not a really super crazy big project, but I've had so much exposure to it. I could also be a QA lead, but so I could do all the roles, but it'd be very overwhelming. And I think the other part is that you want to have a team because you don't always have the same opinions and same angles on things. So if all the thinking about a project comes from one person and then gets told to customer, you're going to miss some stuff. Having a team of 3 roles, let's say a QA lead and LE and a PM, I think you just provide better service, even if the PM is the only point of contact. But to me, from I think you're a better LSP if you can provide those direct technical expertise directly to the audience, because the PM would be speaking to somebody on the other side that's also some kind of program manager or project manager, and then the developer would get another secondhand, the information secondhand. So it goes through multiple people to the developer. To me, that's just not productive. Developers speak a different language. I think engineers speak a different language. You want them to talk directly. So to me, that's a value add when you can provide an engineer that has the confidence and knowledge to directly talk to developers. It's probably my biggest pet peeve, that engineers who are, I know engineers are often introverted and they like to quietly work on their stuff, but to have an engineer that can have these conversations, is confident in speaking about it with people that they don't necessarily know, is a huge plus to have for a company. If you're a localization provider, hire some engineers that are good communicators. It's really going to pay off.
Yeah, I remember you were highlighting communication as the most important skill that you look for when you hire someone. Is this one of the reasons?
Yes, it is. That doesn't mean, you can't just focus on that, of course. And I hiring is very difficult. That's a whole different topic. I don't know if you have questions about it later, but it's a big topic, and it's very difficult to establish how well somebody's going to do during an interview process. I found that out. Um, it it's honestly not. I don't mind doing it, but it's not my favorite thing because I don't feel like I'm the best at it. Um, but yeah, that's a whole probably multiple questions in there. I don't know if you're going to touch on it, but I know we touched on it in a different podcast.
Yes. But one thing that I wanted to ask you when you mentioned about the new customers, where you don't have those established connections, maybe even for the people who are, let's say, more introverted, that are not so good with communication and building those relationships, how does it actually start? Let's say we have a new customer. Is the first interaction, okay, let's say the first interaction is maybe with someone from sales or, I don't know, account managers. But then when it comes to the actual production, like how are we going to help that client localize their stuff? Is it more common to have the PMs have the first contact with the client, or is it the LEs?
It depends a little bit, but I encourage my team to, especially if it's something really small, right? So if the customer sends you a Word document, maybe have an LD a quick look at it. Is there something weird going on? Um, and then that might be it. But if it's anything bigger, I like to have a first call with an engineer, and I encourage it because you get that first shot at it to put in your little um, thoughts about internationalization into the customer's mind. It's the first shot that really matters. And so I think if you can, for if something that looks like a larger project, we have often done it. It's a program manager, a project manager, and an LE. In a few cases, if they need heavy QA, they might even invite a QA lead. Especially if it's a fairly high chance that this is going to happen, that we know they're going to need it. It's probably going to happen. It's not necessarily like this, oh, we just want to get an idea what the ballpark cost is. So if an engineer in there, because you get to ask them some questions and you get to already maybe see some potential issues, and you throw that right in there saying, hey, there's some stuff you have to think about here and we can help you with that. We're going to bake it into our estimate, and it's really going to help you down the road because it's going to save you time with this and this and this. Actually going to save you money, right? You want to throw that in there. Can a PM do that? Possibly. Some PMs can do that, but PMs are often happy to have that other person in there, because it takes the pressure off them to catch all those things. So the PM can focus on the PM part of the conversation, and then the engineer can add their piece to it. I love working like that. First, I love working with PMs. And I think those first opportunities are just so valuable and so critical. If you can't do that because it's just this first contact thing, maybe it has to happen quickly, there's no LE available, then you might say, okay, the PM could maybe say, hey, we'd love to get into a few of the technical things. If you want to do another session, a short session, and have an engineer there, it would really be helpful and it would benefit you, and it might actually help you reduce your cost. You definitely always want to sell it, right? Internationalization, even if you don't have a technical person in that first call.
But okay, but that's maybe my question about that. Like, do you consider yourself to be a salesperson, or did you pick up some sales skills over the time? Or do you think it's really just the fact that you are so into it that you can explain it with your enthusiasm that the clients just get it?
I can sell a little bit. I mean, I'm not, I don't really like selling. I don't want that to be my job, to be in pre-sales. I had an opportunity I was approached for a pre-sales position for a company, and I liked aspects of it, but I didn't like necessarily the pre-sales part because I don't want to do that. That's my main thing. But yeah, you're selling a service. Internationalization is a service, and you're selling it. It could provide us with, at least upfront, extra hours, right? That we can charge the customer, but then they will recover at the end, hopefully multiple times, with reduced QA and a better product, and reduced hours on their development team too. So yeah, it is. There's a little bit of sales in there, and yes, I do get very excited about it. But that takes us back again to hiring an engineer who can communicate well, right? If you invite an engineer into a meeting and they don't dare to say anything and ask any questions, you're not getting any of the benefits. So they have to be comfortable. And I think that is that shows a certain amount of, it's not just the person's personality, it's also a certain amount of seniority on the engineer side. You don't want to put a junior LE in that position, probably, unless they're exceptional at it, but then maybe they're not junior anymore. So yeah, you want to have a person that can communicate and is really just comfortable to analyze things on the fly. And I think that's an underappreciated quality, honestly, of an internationalization engineer or localization engineer, to be able to just look at a situation with relatively little information and immediately start to pinpoint some stuff. That's incredibly valuable. That's like somebody inspecting your house and immediately seeing 10 problems, right, that you should fix. Another person misses half of them. Who is more valuable to you? Yes, your cost will go up because you have to maybe fix more issues, but those issues are not going to come up when you sell the house, and the other inspector by the other party is going to find them, right? So it applies to many areas. I think to be able to do that is extremely valuable. Maybe it's underappreciated. I think it should be highly appreciated, honestly.
Is it like playing a detective when you do the internationalization assessment?
Yeah, it's a little bit, especially if you don't have a lot of information. Initial call, you're not going to get the full of everything, but I think you can still, just ask a few very pointed questions, maybe about maybe the user interface or the use cases or audience, or what underlying technology they're expecting to use, depending on where it's at in the development, right? So a few questions can give you some opportunities to potentially point out some stuff.
When new companies come to you and the internationalization expert has to sort of sell that service, and then you charge them something extra at the front, that actually leads me to the question that I shared with you. So is internationalization something that we do maybe in the beginning? Is it a one-time thing just to, prepare everything for the future development? Or is it an ongoing process and you as an internationalization expert are still needed for the client?
Yeah, so there's two questions here. So the upfront, I mean, you don't charge them anything extra upfront. That's just part of localization, right? It's not extra. That's the problem, that we sometimes look at it as extra. It's part of it, just like project management and translation and QA. It's just part of a full localization package. And that literally you put the finger on the problem, that it's looked at as extra. It shouldn't be looked at as, it's not. You can't do localization without internationalization. It's not extra. It's part of what you need to do. And you don't have to sell it as something extra. You just say, you can't do one. You have to present to the customer that one doesn't go without the other, because the problems you're going to run into if you don't skip. Just like saying, I'm going to skip translation, and then they complain that the UI is not in German. Well, yeah, you didn't pay for it, translation. So you skip internationalization, then you complain that you have issues with address formats, or it doesn't, or users complain about date formats not being ambiguous and stuff like that, because you didn't do the work. It's the same thing, but nobody would think about skipping translation if you want to localize a product, right? Because it's like, duh. So I want it to be the same with internationalization, but it's harder for people to grasp. So, but you have to put it in those terms. If somebody really asks, you don't break it out. You don't break it out on an estimate. Internationalization is an optional line item. It's just part of the engineering process. It's just baked into the estimate. So, meaning the person who estimates has to take that into account and make it part of that. Allocate enough time. We do it automatically in our company. We do internationalization assessment, and then of course, you have to decide how much is needed. And then also we do what we call a content review, where we actually review at least part of the source content to make sure the quality is good, so the translators are not going to have problems. That's part of internationalization as well. So yeah, it's not optional. And then ongoing costs, it's really the same. Yes, of course, there is. If it's a one-time localization, you get the source content, you translate, you deliver, and you're done, then a lot of the work is going to be upfront. But if it's a project that's going to iterate, they're going to add features, and so you're going to do 5-6 releases in a year. Of course, you have to allocate a small amount for internationalization into each iteration, because there are always going to be some new issues where they're going to introduce some new internationalization issue, hopefully less over time as you educate them more, right? The product should get better and better as time progresses, but developers are still going to introduce issues, so there's still a small amount of effort that you're going to have to put in over time. You don't want to skip that.
Really? Okay, let me elaborate on that question, please. But wouldn't those issues later on be mostly discovered by the QA team? Isn't internationalization really about, I don't know, like we said, education, or how to do the layout and how to, I don't know, separate the strings? So if the developers are following it, do you really think that with each new feature and each new version, there could be new types of internationalization issues?
Well, there could be. It depends what they're adding, but the thing is, you don't want to wait for QA unless QA does internationalization assessment. You might have a QA lead or a tester who's trained in that. Then they can do the assessment. It doesn't have to be an localization engineer. It just has to be somebody who's knowledgeable. But what you don't want to do is skip any internationalization assessment, translate the product, throw it at 20 different testers for 20 different languages, and everybody reports the same issue, duplicates of all the 20 bugs about date formats, and that's when it becomes. And then so all the time spent by the QA testers on that, and then somebody has to scrub all those bugs, review them, determine that they're duplicates, and then communicate it back to the dev team. That's a lot of extra effort, right, for potentially one issue times 20. I always say an issue might multiply times the number of languages and times the number of places it's seen in the product. So if you have 5 places and 20 languages, you could have 100 bugs where it really was just one issue that you could have caught up front and had the developer implement correctly in all places, and you avoid all that. So yeah, I don't think it's kind of one of the cardinal rules, so to speak, that you want to identify it up front. It's much cheaper.
So how does so for what you just said to me, it's a sort of like a new thing that you need internationalization assessment or input with every new, let's say, project. If we think about it from the project perspective, how does it actually fit into the, let's say, the agile model and the, I would say, consistent request from the clients to deliver projects as soon as possible? Don't you think like it adds a lot of extra time?
It's a good question. And I've worked on a few projects that were used agile methodology and fairly short cycles, and a couple different approaches that we used. So a couple thoughts here. So one was that let's say they have a 3-week cycle, right? But not every 3-week cycle will necessarily result in a product that goes to an end user. There may be some products where literally they do an actual build and release every 3 weeks, right? That's possible. You probably have certain apps at home. I use Quicken for my financial tracking, and I get updates pretty frequently, but maybe once a month. So that's a pretty quick release cycles. And then other ones you don't even notice it. With Chrome, you probably don't even notice when it updates in the background. So that's pretty common. But so if the product is released for every cycle, then of course you have to do um, translation for every cycle, right? If the product is multilingual. And I think, but what happens is that the plan for a cycle doesn't start at the end of the previous cycle. Right? So you can work on issues like you don't have an idea for a feature, you come up with a rough idea, you work out all the requirements, you do all the coding, all the testing in 3 weeks. It's not possible. So your cycles are going to overlap. There are people working on something that's going to be implemented 3 cycles down the road, 4 cycles, or even farther if it's a really big thing. So what you want to do is you want to, so there's two things. You want to involve an engineer on the localization side to see if any internationalization assessment is needed, right? What kind of feature is it? What kind of potential pitfalls? So spending a small amount of time to see if there's something, is there any meat on the bone, so to speak, or is it just, oh, we're just adding a new error message there. That's the feature. Okay, probably doesn't need it a lot. So it really depends. So you want to have an LE involved, ideally. That's where the integration into the development team by the LE is really helpful. Somebody, for a large program, it's really worth it to have an LE that just kind of is maybe in some of those meetings, maybe in the meetings where the different issues are prioritized and knowing about new features. I've worked on projects like that. It's really cool because you're really part of the team and you always see all the new stuff and what's coming. You get to think about it as you go and give that input. And the other part is, of course, when you have to do translation. If you have to do those quick cycles, then it's crunch time, right? So you don't have a lot of time. The internationalization issues have to be identified before, if there are any. But for products that don't get a public release every cycle, you might not do translation for every cycle, right? So you may have 3-week cycles, but you say you're going to only do translation once every 2 months or every 3 cycles, and that gives you, people still have to freeze the content and the strings and all that, so you still have to give enough time, but you don't have to do this constant every 3-week localization cycle. So you could slow them down and say, we're only going to do every 3rd cycle, we're going to do localization. That's possible. It really depends on the need of the product and how often you have public releases. Or sometimes you have releases to OEMs, right? If it's a company that localizes, gives it to the software to OEMs to integrate on platforms, for example, which with Intel happens a lot, utilities and stuff like that. Then you give it to OEMs. It's pre-release, but they still want to see it localized because the Lenovo wants to see the Chinese version and or whatever other languages they're shipping. They want to have somebody look at it before they integrate onto their platform. So you still have to be ready before the release. So really, all that depends on the product, release cycles, and needs for early localization or what kind of testing cycles you have. But yes, you cannot. Yeah, I don't think you can decouple internationalization from that.
Is the effort that goes into internationalization proportionate to the number of languages that we localize the product into? Or is it more about the different, let's say sets of languages?
It's not about the number of languages, and it could be about the number of countries, which is not the same thing, right? Because if you're just adding, you already do German, you just add French, but you're actually shipping worldwide with all the languages. You can just switch languages, and you don't really have any features that are country specific. Adding French is very easy. They're both Latin. They use the same fonts, they use the same everything. So it's almost free, other than translation and enhancing the language selection in your product, or changing the installer to add French. Pretty simple, right? So it's not about number of languages, but if you have, of course, languages that use, different fonts, different layout, then you might have some issues. So you could be adding Russian, and all of a sudden your screen has all kinds of truncation issues because the words are so long and the sentences are so long, compared to maybe just, if you do simplified Chinese where it's shorter. So languages can cause problems, but generally that doesn't, it's not exponential for sure, or it's not additive as in, 1 hour of internationalization. Now I have to do 2 hours of internationalization because I'm adding one language. It's not like that. It's really um, the complexity of the product and how many features you have that have potential localization issues, right? So, I mean, it's really simple. If your product is only displaying one error message and has no UI otherwise, pretty easy, right? You have to make sure it's not truncated, and you have to make sure the font is appropriate for the message, and it's not hard coded. I think those are probably about the three things. Maybe don't have any string concatenation. So maybe four is still, even though it's simple error messages, right? You have one error message. You could, if it's a dialogue you create and you design, you have 4 potential internationalization issues just with one error message. So no, there's no free lunch, man.
But does the number of, I don't know, should I say locales, does it really not affect the effort? What if, for example, I don't know, like let's say I created my, I don't know, software or app. Most of the companies, I would say, start with the English market or English speaking market. And maybe then they say, okay, I want to conquer Europe. So they're going to start localizing into European languages. Would the effort be different than from a company who decides to go pretty much everywhere in the world, including like, I don't know, Asian languages, right to left languages, and so on? Or would the effort be the same?
Yeah, no. So we kind of made that distinction already, because when you add languages with different scripts, of course, you're adding layers of complexity, right? So if it's all Latin-based languages using Latin characters, then I think it's mostly length. That's your difference, right? Length of the text, string length. But when you're adding, simplified Chinese Thai, then you need different fonts. It's going to affect your layout. Word wrapping is going to be an issue. They're more you don't have spaces, you don't have periods, you don't have space between words in Thai. Japanese is very picky. Chinese sometimes too about where to wrap words. So there's a whole layer of complexity that adds. Right to left or bidirectional languages they're adding. That's usually the biggest lift for people. So adding languages can add to the internationalization, but it's not you can't just say, effort is X for one language and effort is X times 2 or 2X for 2 languages and then 3X for 3. That really depends. It depends on what languages you're adding. And also it really depends on what kind of features you have in your product, right? With especially bidirectional, you're going to have, depending on your UI and depending what kind of content you're displaying, especially we see issues with when you have a mix of words and numbers and other characters. Sometimes the rendering can be weird. So issues can be created. And you also said locales, and locales to me are geographic locations, not languages. So locales are a little different because you may have country-specific things. We talked address format before, or currency, or decimals, right? For example, Switzerland and Germany use different decimal convention for numbers formatting, even though they're both German-speaking countries. So language not equals locale. I think that's one of the most common misconceptions. Language does not equal, that the misconception is that language equals locale, but the truth is language does not equal locale. How often do you see language selectors that say a specific locale? So it says German, Germany in the language selector. So what is that? Exclude the Swiss audience or the Luxembourg audience or the Austrian audience? Is there something specific to Germany? Why doesn't it just say German? So that depends, right? You have to be precise about those things. Or we had a case where we say, this is a thing we had with Intel where we had English pages, we had the simplified Chinese pages, and it said PRC, right, or mainland China, and you cannot access YouTube from China. So there are rules around language to say, okay, don't put YouTube links on the Chinese website. And that's true for the audience that's in China, but if it's a Chinese speaker using the Chinese site on outside of China, they could you view the YouTube video. It just shows you language not equals location. There are different challenges with adding a language or adding a location.
Right. So what, in your opinion, is the most difficult language to internationalize for?
Well, I mean, I don't know all the languages and I haven't done with all of them. There are more than we can count, right? But of the, I would say the maybe top 40, top 50 in the world, I see the most issues with bidirectional, mostly because there's just no readiness for it unless the framework that people use has an easy way to flip. Just basically set one parameter and it just flips everything, mirrors everything properly. With websites that usually pretty good, plain HTML, right? It's one attribute and it pretty much takes care of it for you. There's some frameworks that have that, and then other frameworks may not be as good at that. I'm not an expert on the specific frameworks, but just what I've seen is I've seen applications where they would change the rendering, but then they did a lot of custom stuff in the UI, maybe not super standard, and then it causes problems. It doesn't flip everything properly, and they have to then manually make some fixes around it. So from what I've seen, and my exposure is fairly limited to working with Intel, but that one's tough. And then the other part is with like I said, the word wrapping in Japanese and Thai. If you care about it in a software UI, it gets really tricky because you have to individually, manipulate the text to wrap the way it's nicer to read for the reader. And you have to ask yourself, is that worth the effort? Or is the reader going to be, if it's a technical application, does it matter that much? If it's like a little driver configuration utility, or a hardware configuration utility for a piece, for some hardware you have in your computer, do you really care that much if it's wrapping at the right character? The reader is still going to be able to read it. So it may not be worth it. But if it's something really slick, like a marketing presentation where you do desktop publishing, you want to have somebody go there and you want it to be perfect, right? Advertising, marketing, you want it to be perfect. So that's definitely an area where it's a lot of extra work. To do that. I wish we had more advanced frameworks for that text wrapping thing. I know I'm keep coming back to this one thing, but it's one thing we haven't really solved. I know there's some solutions out there. I've seen one being at least tried out in my field, but maybe that's where AI could be helpful. Well, I know you may have a question about that later, so we can defer that to later. But that shouldn't have to be a human having to do that. The information exists. How can we not automate that? But there's so many different ways we're displaying content. How is it going to work in every, for all the different software frameworks, content delivery formats? How is it going to work for everything? We certainly haven't solved that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, since you touched on it, I was going to ask it anyway. What do you think is going to be the role of AI specifically for internationalization? Have you seen any experiments? Have you done any experiments yourself? Have you tried, ChatGPT for something that you normally used to do manually?
I've asked it one question. I think I've tried it once. I've been a little busy, honestly, but and it's one of those things. It's fascinating, and I'm asking myself, how deep into it do I want to get, unless I need to use it professionally. But I think there should be a lot of opportunities there in localization, honestly. And I haven't deeply immersed myself, I have to admit. So I'm certainly in no way an expert on it. I just don't know enough. But just that example, I can probably think of some areas where it could really save time. Why are we doing certain things manually? But there are other areas where I think human judgment is still going to be important in localization. But improvement, so I mean, machine translation, quality insurance, automated quality insurance. I think there's a lot of room there for much more intelligent solutions. And I don't know what would be considered AI and what's just a a good automated solution that doesn't involve AI. I don't have enough expertise there, but I'm sure there's lots there. I know a lot of companies are looking at it. There's also a lot of buzzing out there with not much behind it yet. Where that's going to go, that might be for the next generation to solve. Of localization experts. There's so many young people in the industry, and I think them growing up with those technologies, I really hope they're going to do some very, very cool stuff in that area. Um, and Yeah, I think there's a lot there. There's a lot there. People just have to get creative. We just still do too many things manually that are not, they're based on some kind of algorithms and some kind of logic. They can be solved with technology.
Well, now that got me thinking that one of the easiest thing that you could do is simply give your code to ChatGPT and ask it if it's well internationalized.
I can't put code that's under an NDA into ChatGPT, of course. So I can't just take,
but
well, you can't because there are policies around it. But it's an interesting question, right? So you could take some public examples of some code that's out publicly and do that with. That'd be really interesting, and I think that'd be really good for a developer to do. I'm actually quite. I do listen to a lot of information and how you ask ChatGPT to come up with code. I don't know how much knowledge it would have about internationalization, what it would come up with. Be really interesting. It should be done by a developer that's where a developer with the internationalization knowledge would be fantastic to see what kind of stuff to come up with and really evaluate that. I think that'd be great, honestly. Could be a great help because we have code scanning tools, right? There are multiple. I know Microsoft has one. There's a Globalizer that we used for a while, and they're tedious and they're a lot. It's a lot of effort to set up. It's a lot of false positives when you run reports, and then you have to have a human wade through that. It's not productive. And it's like, who wants to do that? It's kind of mind-numbing work, honestly, too, just to find a handful of issues, right? To have, I have 2,000 results in this code scan, and now I have to find the 3 or 4 that are valid issues that actually need to be fixed. I don't know how much better those tools have gotten. I'm currently not exposed to the kind of latest generation of those, but you would think that there's a lot of opportunity there. Yeah, how cool would that be, right? To train an engine specifically on internationalization issues and know how to eliminate false positives. Cool. Somebody's going to do it. I know somebody's going to do it. It's not going to be me.
Well, maybe it's already done, but we just don't know about it.
It might be. I mean, or at least somebody's working on it. Yeah, no, fantastic stuff. Honestly, it's probably one of the more frustrating efforts I've been involved in was code scanning and dealing with. Oh, we have 25,000 results, from a relatively small piece of code. Is like you can't throw that at a developer and say, "Hey, go figure out what to fix," right? So manually filtering that is painful.
Assuming that all the software would be already written perfectly and internationalized well, what would you be doing at that point? Where do you think that the biggest value a human could add? Especially like in your case, because we were talking that you're mostly focusing on software, right? Which a lot of it has to do with how developers do their job well and how familiar they are already with the principles of internationalization. And software development is one of the key areas that I think is being affected by AI. And let's look at it from the positive perspective that it helps them be more efficient rather than taking their jobs. So assuming that the AI could help them also with internationalization, what do you think in that scenario, where would be the biggest value that someone like you with your experience could still add value?
I would probably just retire at the beach. But that's a nice picture, right? If none of that is needed anymore, it's just built in, right? And I think we should push for that. There's no, but I just don't. I'm kind of interesting because I tend to be a little bit of a pessimist at times in that regard, because you have um, yeah, you can take something and put it into, let's say you could put in ChatGPT and it could tell you what all the internationalization issues are. But to make that globally available, it has to interface with every content management system, with any content format, right? And take into account maybe some other factors that I maybe can't think of right now, but those are just two other parameters: content format and the tool that the content is in. And it has to be able to handle that. So there are all these integrations that have to happen, unless there's some kind of universal interface to everything, right? Like if you want to interface your translation management system with a content management system, there has to be either a direct API integration or some kind of in-between connector, which both exists. And there are hundreds of thousands of implementations like that in the world. So now you have to tie in that AI piece that does that work for you. And it has to be done for the code, for the content itself, right? So it's so many different pieces. So I don't think we'll ever get there. But I think we'll get there on a large level where we have, large, like, especially large products with companies that have a lot of money that can implement that kind of stuff. I think you'll see it first, and I think it would just shift the way the role that the localization engineer is. Not, I don't know exactly where it would shift to, but there's always the human factor. The human factor doesn't go away until all humans are eradicated from the earth. It's always going to be there. There's going to be human error, and there's going to be some things that are not just going to be automatically detected and corrected. So I'm a pessimist in that regard, in a good way, because I don't think the localization engineer is going to be obsolete. Not in my lifetime, at least.
Well, you're going to retire soon.
Not that soon. Not that soon. I still have excitement left.
Besides AI, what is it that you are curious about right now?
It's interesting. I've never been super interested. I'm not an expert on machine translation, for example. And I know, that's, I guess we don't consider that AI. Maybe I don't know how close it gets to AI. What MT engines do, it's not my area of expertise. But I think we should be doing better with MT quality. MT quality should be better by now. I still see so many issues around translation quality that are not solved. So I think it's adjacent to AI, and AI may help solve that. But so that's one area. Curious. To me, the most fun part of internationalization is the people connection part, and that's why one reason why I took the specific question, this specific new challenge, this new job, and I'm not retiring. So if anybody who I'm going to be working with is hearing this, I'm not retiring. I'm taking on a new challenge because it's exactly what I love, and what I am curious about is I get to be in the middle of it, and I get to really, it's all going to be about people interaction and making things better from an internationalization point of view, and that does excite me. Where exactly it's going to go, I don't know yet. I haven't started yet. I don't know exactly what the challenges are going to be, but it's always been what excited me. It was not sitting, that's maybe why I don't like coding so much, because I don't like just sitting in a cube and coding away. I'm a little bit introverted, but not that introverted. I do like to communicate with people. That the people connections have always been a huge part of my work that I loved, and it keeps me going. And so that is what gets me excited.
What else besides work, like outside of work?
I don't have that much going on outside of work. When you get old, like me, you spend a lot more time on self-care. So self-care is a big thing. So between self-care and a little bit of family and work and not enough sleep, there's not a lot of time left. So some things will have to wait till later. Also at our age, some of us have elderly parents that are taking up some of our time, be it to travel to see them or to have them close and maybe spend time with them. But one thing I noticed, and this is very personal too, is um, through some of it was that pandemic, and some of it was my deep immersion in my work over time, and also raising children, which is very challenging. Um, I haven't um, kept my personal connection alive enough with friends and people. Just kind of they're there somewhere, but I haven't really kept that going. And I really encourage people to spend time doing that. So I'm actually started doing that again, and that really gets me excited. I had a spontaneous phone call with a friend who is stuck, kind of has some challenges, and he doesn't really get out of the house much. And I had a call with him, and that those are meaningful things. And also, COVID really, I think a lot of us got hunkered down at home. We have our work, we get the remote work, which is great. I love it. I actually love the remote work, but we're neglecting some things, and I think we have to actively um, uh, bring some of those things back in our lives. It can get lonely if you don't get out, and it's not fun. It's not fun to be lonely, and so I started reconnecting with people, and some people from the industry, and some people outside the industry, some family, some old friends, and it's I'm really enjoying it, and just get out more and be out in the city and talk to random people. That's actually one thing that excites me too, and taking care of my health. I'm neglected my health for some time and started having some back problems, and I'm working on fixing that, and that's been really fun too, and challenging. So
I have a bunch of questions here based on what you just said. What is it that inspired you to start reaching out to people?
honestly, and we're getting a little away from localization, which is totally fine with me. I think it's important to not just be, thinking about your work, but I think there's two things. The team that I've worked with at Summa Lingue, which I'm leaving today officially, or it's been an amazing team to work with. Before that was Global Me, where you were part of. Amazing people to work with, and I just really appreciated all those connections, and I don't want to lose those connections as I'm stepping away from that job. The people mean something to me. They're good friends of mine. And also seeing another thing is, we talk about elderly parents. I see my parents, my mom's mind has pretty much gone. She has severe dementia, and my dad is taking care of her, and she was the social one and he was not. And with her kind of fading away, and socially, he's left with not much connection, and he had to try very hard to step out of his comfort zone to create at least some social connections, because he can get really lonely. And I don't want to do that. So I want to learn from my mom to nurture the human connections and stay in touch with friends. Doesn't matter how far away they are. You can make, these days it's so beautiful. You can have a call with somebody in the Philippines and talk for a couple hours, and it's just the most fantastic. I mean, how do you not walk away from that happy, right? Unless you don't get along, I guess. But then you probably wouldn't have a 2 hour call. But and doing that with my dad, and asking him to get an Android phone so we can do video calls, and little things like that. You just got to make these little efforts, and I think that's uh, if you work in an industry that long, it's been almost 30 years for me. The longevity can be curtailed, right, if you don't take care of yourself. So I think it's really nice that you brought that up, because I think you have to keep that balance. It's nice to be excited about localization and internationalization, but you really have to get excited about other stuff in life too. And if you ever do step away, you want to have something to be excited about that you're stepping into as well, right? And I think if somebody, at some point retires from the industry, I don't know if localization is going to be in their lives daily. Some people might still do it on as kind of as a hobby, but other people might, they want to move on to something new. You want something to be there. So
I think I discussed this with some previous guests whenever we talk about connections and, like reconnecting with people that you used to know or used to be more in touch with. And now that you mentioned that actually you're leaving Summa and you want to keep in touch with the people, in my experience, this is what a lot of the people say. I think it's kind of like like cliche, but it's like something people wish for when they leave. They're like, everybody's telling you, like, like you write your last email, like, thank you, it was nice working with you, and let's stay in touch. And everybody will be like, yeah, 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 we'll stay in touch. But in my experience, at least, is that they never do. So, do you have some sort of a plan, or are you being systematic about reaching out to people, whether it's from Suma or past friends, or do you really leave it just for some spontaneous moments when?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. It's something we do say casually, and then we end up not doing it. But that's exactly my point. It does take some conscious effort. I don't know if I have a specific plan, but I know I want that to be part of what I spend my time on, and I actually decided to work only 75%, 30 hours in my new job, 30 hours a week, because I want that balance. I want to have time for things other than work. And as I get older, that gets more difficult when I work full time. So I decided this would be a really good balance. Yeah, you have to do it consciously. I have this fantasy of actually traveling around the country and stopping in places where I do have friends and visiting them. I don't know if that's a full-fledged plan, but it's certainly something I could see myself do. And I think it'd be extremely enjoyable. Having coffee with Andre Cito in Vancouver, that sounds pretty darn good.
Well, I don't drink coffee, but we'll
Damn,
go
what's wrong with you?
something else.
I'm going to tweet
Another
that
thing that
out. Did you know Andre Cito doesn't like coffee?
I think I mentioned it many times. Yeah, I don't drink coffee. Another thing that was interesting to me when you mentioned that you enjoy talking to random people. Again, do you have some sort of strategy? Because I sort of do have a strategy about that. How do you how do you initiate the contact, and what is the first thing that you talk with them about? Because I think, at least for me, this is a big thing. How do you get connected with someone you just met, so that the conversation is not very, like, on the surface for too long? Like, hey, it's what is the weather and so on.
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually like that question because in my career, I went to a few conferences, not many. I went to a Unico conference a couple times, to a couple sales conferences when I was with another company, and I never liked it because it I was kind of forced to talk to people, right? You have your booth that you're in potentially, or there's some kind of event, and I always felt like I wasn't particularly comfortable in that mode. So that doesn't now necessarily work for me. I'm not a big fan of going to conferences. I'm not the right person for that. I can do it, but I honestly, I don't feel at ease fully. It's pretty random. You would not believe I'm a big coffee drinker, and we have a lot of coffee shops in Portland. And I like to try them all out. I mean, we have hundreds, right? And so I actually tend to start conversations with baristas. If it's not very busy, they're not very busy. It's a quiet time. I've had very long, very deep conversations with baristas. Sharing stuff that you wouldn't otherwise share with somebody you just met. Or and sometimes it's a place you go frequently, and it's the same person. You get to know them. So I've had a lot of those. But I've also occasionally just talked to somebody when I'm out for a walk in the neighborhood. I do a lot of walking. And sometimes somebody says, "Hey, I've seen you around walking, and how you doing?" And then you start talking, and you get kind of into a long thing. I love these conversations. And then you might see that person again, and you get a little deeper, over time. I like the random ones. They don't necessarily turn into personal relationships, but I still think that those conversations are actually underappreciated. And that's something we lost during COVID, right? People maybe they did a little bit on the street, but you didn't go into coffee shops. You didn't really stand around in stores talking to people because everybody was just kind of focused on getting in and out and, not getting sick, I guess. And so, yeah, that's some examples where I do it. And, of course, with people at work that even maybe somebody I haven't talked to a lot, but I had a chance to be in a call with them. Sometimes we like to add a little bit of personal time. That's another opportunity. Or we even have a thing some workplaces have where they match up people for a chat, like randomly with using a little bot or something, to just match up people and say, hey, why don't you have a chat together? You've never, you may have never talked to each other, and just share that. That's kind of fun. It's a little hard sometimes because you're at work and you're busy, and then to say, okay, now I'm going to add another meeting to my calendar. So that hasn't worked for me personally, but it might work for other people. There's so many opportunities, and then it's also when you have common interests, when you have hobbies, and you meet people through a hobby. Some people it's gaming maybe, or some physical activity they're playing in a sports team or something. There's so many opportunities. It doesn't have to be part of the work environment at all.
What do those small conversations with people that you meet in the street give you? Because you said that it's underappreciated. So what is it that you appreciate about those interactions?
I think the more people you expose yourself to, intellectually or sometimes emotionally, and have these conversations, I think it just always stimulates something. I get ideas from talking to people. I see different struggles that people have. I do have a post-localization. I have some ideas that I don't want to get into right now. It's not formed enough, but there's something I want to do. There's things I want to do. I'm not doing localization until I'm 90, but I always want to keep my brain engaged. And it's brain engagement. I think anytime you talk to somebody, and the older you get, the quicker you lose that. So for maybe if somebody's in their 20s, they automatically tend to be more social and more out and about, and maybe it's automatic and you don't think about it, but I think you have to nurture that. I think it's engagement, it's keeping perspective. If you look at how stuck people are on some people on some viewpoints, it's because they're not engaging. They're not open to engaging with other people who may have different viewpoints. I can talk to somebody who has a very different viewpoint and have a civilized conversation. I think I would never want to lose that ability. And we're a little bit in trouble there, I think, as a society at times.
What is something people seem to misunderstand about you? And I think this could also be connected to what we were just discussing. I'm not sure if you ever built a more, I don't know, let's say, like a friendship with someone you met as a stranger in the street. But this question is really about like, what is the first impression that you think you give to some people, to most of the people, and then over time they discover like, hey, it's actually something different.
It's a little hard to say. I think I'm pretty intense. I talk a lot, and I think that people who know me a little better appreciate that. Whereas somebody who just met me, maybe might be a little bit, too intense at times. I'm very opinionated. I can come across a little bit strong. I've rubbed people the wrong way occasionally, especially about work-related topics. If something is not done the right way, or maybe it's been explained and it continues to not go that way, I will push, and it's because I care. It's only because I care. It's not because I'm a jerk. It's because I care. I care about the outcome. And that's also something I have to check myself on. And then another part that's maybe I find is underappreciated, that I try not to make this sound arrogant, but I don't tend to raise issues unless I'm pretty sure that I'm right. So, I can be wrong. I'm wrong sometimes, but I try to make sure I'm fairly certain that I'm right, and then I will push an issue. And I don't appreciate it when people don't take it seriously, because I don't raise an issue unless, and people who know me also know that if he brings it up, it's probably something we should at least take into consideration. And if it turns out to be a non-issue, then I would, I don't want people to not speak up because they're afraid of that. Like, continue to, if you think something is an issue, it's like if you see something, say something kind of philosophy, right? In many parts of society, if you see something that you think is really problematic, you should speak up if it's safe to do so. And in a work environment, I would say most of the time in our work environment, it's safe to do so. It's usually a technical or process issue. It should be safe to do so. But I still sometimes feel like my opinion is not appreciated enough, and especially in the vendor customer relationship. That can happen where you bring something up and you know it's kind of a big deal and you just get either crickets or you get pushback. That still bugs me. And so that's where on one area I feel misunderstood. Probably sometimes they're underappreciated.
What do you think is wrong with our industry?
I don't think there's anything wrong with our industry. I think we're a few things maybe. I think we're still spending too much time on small stuff and not looking at the big stuff. And that takes me back to internationalization, because with proper internationalization, you can kind of address big things. And, it exactly how you write this sentence, if you slightly change the style of a sentence, spend a lot of time on that, when it really to the end user doesn't make any difference to me. It's kind of wasteful. So I think we should not sweat the small stuff, and we should look at the big stuff. Where are the big gains? And then, we can still fine tune, but get the big gains first. And then if there's time and budget is not an issue, you can then depending on the audience, you have to get a little more into the small things. I know in marketing language, for example, you want to get more into the maybe little preferential things. But when I see somebody spending a lot of time on a technical document cleaning up minor things and arguing over minor linguistic things that really don't matter, that's a waste of time. So how can we focus more on big stuff and let some of the small stuff go?
But it's funny that you said it, because previously you said that you can sometimes come off as a jerk, and the reason for that is that you care. So maybe those people care about those little technical details.
Yes, and I sometimes get lost in small details. I actually have done it many times, because I'm kind of a stickler for things, and so I do it as well. But I think it's still a matter overall. If you want to exist as a provider, I think you have to know where your focus is. The cost, the pressure on cost is so high if you're a provider. To your rate's always supposed to go down, never up, right? Then you become more efficient, and if you want to exist, you have to be able to find a way to do that. And so sweating the small stuff is not going to get you there. Does that make sense? There's another thing. When a company chooses a platform, they get often locked into that platform for a long time, because implementing it and then training everybody and everything is interfacing with it, you're really locked in. And then you have maybe a new product that's a better product, and the switching cost is so high, you tend to stay with the archaic product. And I think I've just seen some examples of that. I think what needs to happen is that the product you're currently using needs to evolve so it always stays current. And you see a lot more of that these days. You see a lot more products that just evolve very quickly, and which comes with its own challenges. But working with archaic tools is a thing I'm still seeing a lot. And I think the thing we mentioned earlier too, that false positives on quality checkers, it's a big challenge. So I think some of the new technologies, opportunities out there, including AI, I think is really, really, really going to make a difference there. And again, that deals with a lot of the small stuff, right? Right. If automation can find and correct small issues, and you don't have to spend hours and hours of a linguist or a QA person, finding those, that's a win, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of room there.
All right. Getting to the second hour of our interview. So my final question to you it's not a question. If you could say the one thing to everyone in the industry, what would be your message?
I don't know if I have this one really big message, but I think definitely focus on collaboration and connection, and also bring in. I say that specifically to people who've been in the industry a little longer. Be a mentor. Too. There's, it's so much easier to get new generation young people into the industry if they encounter strong mentors when they join the company. I've had the pleasure of doing a lot of that, and I still wish I could have done more. There's only so much time in the day. I always enjoyed that part, and it's really fun when you see people come in and you get to do some mentoring, and then you see them actually maybe the really good ones are going to leave you in the dust a little bit, and it's okay. It's a change of generations. That's what you want to see. You want to see progress. You don't, as the more senior person, you don't have to be on top of everything. You don't have to know everything. Let other people get into that and really push that and drive that, and then when it's your time to step away, you step away. You don't have to step away knowing everything. But I think when you can make a difference in that regard, with mentoring people and getting people excited about stuff and expanding their tool set and their knowledge, to me, that's exciting. So that is one message I have for don't hoard information and protect your space in the industry because you're getting older. Share it with people and bring them along. And it's not just other LEs, I think there's so much influence you can have on project managers and QA testers and QA leads by always sharing. Always be generous with what you're sharing. Just little things like, let's say there's a technical problem and the PM comes to you with a technical problem in a translation tool. You could just fix it and say, oh, I fixed it. Or you could share what the problem was and how you fixed it, because people are going to read it. And these days, it's often not done in email. It's in a communication tool like Teams or Slack, right? And other people can see it. And so everybody who sees it learns from it. And then next time they're going to know, oh, yeah, we had this issue before. So that's so cool to be able to share it this way. It's not in this, limited audience. You have a much broader audience because you have these communities and channels and chats, right, where you get to share that. Just share information. It's the best part of the job to me.